Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of our virtual conference. We've had quite compelling presentations so far, and I know the session we're about ready to do will be as compelling also. I'm David Ramser. I'm a board member of the Historical Society, and unlike many of my colleagues, I'm not a professional historian, but came to it and to the board through my interest in Russia. As Governor Steve Cooper's press secretary back in the late 80s, I began interacting with the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. And like many Alaskans of that era, I caught Russian fever pretty severely, spent a lot of time there, and got so inspired that I wrote a book about Alaska-Russia interactions. And one of today's speakers, Mimi Chapin, was a pioneer in that area and remains one of the few Alaskans who are keeping that relationship between Alaska and Russia alive today. So today's session is about Alaska's international relationships, and given our state's proximity and active relationship with other countries, especially to the west, it's sometimes said that we're one of the few states that could justify having our own State Department. Now, we had planned to start this session back in the 16th century when the West was still trying to figure out where and what Alaska was, but we had a miscue with our first presenter. He may be still lost in the Bering Strait, but he won't be joining us today. So we're going to give the two other speakers a hair more time, and we invite lots of questions from you, which you can either put in the chat or the Q&A section of the Zoom.
Actually, we prefer the chat.
Okay, in the chat. So let's start with Chris Allan, who is a Fairbanksan for the National Park Service. Chris, who moderated an earlier session on mining, is a specialist on the Klondike Gold Rush. And he's also fondly known for coming up with bizarre oddments for our quarterly newsletter. Chris is going to explore early Alaska-Canadian border relations. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, David. All right, hello everyone, and thank you for being here for these presentations. I'd first like to introduce you to a person, our protagonist, George Melvin Miller. And I may have to start again. My screen sharing. All right, here we go again. I would like to introduce you first to a person. Our protagonist, his name is George Melvin Miller. In the 1880s, he was a lawyer and real estate broker in Oregon. He promoted the development of Eugene and the coastal town of Florence. George had a famous brother, Joaquin Miller, who was a writer and raconteur, and he was often called the poet of the Sierras. And Joaquin went to the Klondike as a reporter in 1897. And George followed him the next year in order to mine for gold in the Allan mining district and other locations. But he also worked as a lawyer in Wrangell, Juneau, and Skagway. Now, George became part of a grassroots movement, and I'm using this term loosely here, of Americans who framed the Canadians and the British, who controlled Canada's foreign policy, as sneaky aggressors who were out to seize the disputed territory along the unresolved border of the Alaska Panhandle. Next, I would like to introduce you to a place, a corner office in the White Pass and Yukon Railway Depot in Skagway. This is where the Canadian customs agent, Edward Busby, collected duties on imported goods going into Canada on the train and generally tried to be a good civil servant. Now, this office you could see today because the building has been restored. This is the depot, and the next building over is the Railway Administration Building. Both were restored by the National Park Service and serve as their headquarters for the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park. Now you see Skagway and Dyea, both at the on the upper Lynn Canal, were at the epicenter of what we call the Alaska boundary dispute, which flared up in 1897 with the gold discoveries in the Klondike and elsewhere. And here is the boundary dispute in a nutshell. The north-south border of Alaska from Mount St. Elias up to the Arctic Ocean was established on the 141st meridian back in 1825 by Great Britain and the Russian Tsar Alexander I. But the language relating to the 2,000-mile border around the Panhandle was ambiguous. It was certainly open to interpretation. Now, with multiple gold discoveries and thousands of stampeders entering the country, the Canadians wanted a boundary closer to the ocean, and that's represented here by the shaded area on the map. But more importantly, they wanted the ocean ports of Skagway and Dyea because these were the easiest routes to the continental interior. Now the Americans, and I'm paraphrasing here, said, hell no, the border must be further inland, at least at the summits of Chilkoot Pass and White Pass, and preferably further inland, like 30 miles from the ocean at Lake Bennett. And this situation caused a great deal of anger and confusion among the gold miners who were crossing this ill-defined border, and for the Canadian police who were trying to save people's lives by encouraging them to bring enough food and other supplies to survive the winter in the Klondike, and customs agents who were trying to do their jobs for either Canada or the United States. There were U.S. Army troops stationed in Skagway, and there were also the business interests in British Columbia and the U.S. West Coast that were concerned with trade and the movement of goods north into Alaska and then into Canada. So in 1899, the two sides, that is Great Britain and Canada on one side and the United States on the other, agreed on a temporary settlement. This is called a modus vivendi. It's a Latin term meaning a temporary agreement. And that meant that neither side would agree to give up its territorial claims, but that they would establish a temporary line. And so those lines are in red here over the Chilkoot Pass and the White Pass, and then along the Klahini River north of Klukwan and north of Haines Mission, or Haines today. And so this made it easier for the border officials and the police and everyone else to get along regarding the border. And here's an example from 1899 of White Pass with the flags of each nation on either side. For the most part, the situation remained peaceful. The Canadian police were good at catching criminals, even if they crossed the border, and their policy of bringing 1 ton of supplies was something that undoubtedly saved lives during the height of the Klondike rush. But there were simmering resentments. And I'd like to jump ahead by 2 years now to 1901. The White Pass and Yukon Railway was financed by British investors, and it had greatly improved the transportation of goods. You can see the depot there and what would be Busby's office on the right of that building. And so I mentioned that there was this customs office in the depot, and it benefited everybody, Canadians and Americans, anybody who was doing business with the gold mining districts nearby, or with White House and Dawson City. And a lot of goods, of course, went all the way through that route and onto the Yukon River and then into the Alaskan interior as well. So in June 1901, Edward Busby, the customs agent for Canada, received orders to raise a customs flag near his office. And I don't see a flagpole in this picture, but we'll have to imagine it. So this under ordinary circumstances would have been uncontroversial. Other places on the continent, a customs flag would not have been a big deal, but there was a problem. George Miller and other Americans in Skagway had heard rumors that a foreign flag was going to be raised on what they regarded as U.S. sovereign soil. They knew that an international tribunal was still trying very slowly to resolve the border question, and they thought they might tip the balance in America's favor, or at least antagonize the Canadian authorities. So they believed that Busby was about to raise the Union Jack, the British imperial flag that also served as the Canadian flag, and that Busby did not plan to place an American flag above it on the flagpole, which would have been the convention on foreign soil if for a Canadian consulate or something of that nature. This was the flag that Busby was planning to raise, and it was a Saturday, June 22nd, 1901, when this flag went to the top of a flagpole outside of Busby's office. And George Miller was in the area. In fact, he was across the street. He observed this. Some people say that the flag was flying for a couple days. Other reports say that Miller took action on the very same day that it appeared. In any case, Miller walked across Broadway, the main street there in Skagway, across the railroad tracks that ran down the middle of that street. He pulled out his pocket knife and he cut the halyards, that is the ropes that operate the flagpole that bring the flag to the top of the pole. He pulled the flag down, rolled it into a ball, and kicked it unceremoniously into a dusty corner of the railway depot. Within seconds, Edward Busby burst out of his office door and demanded to know who had committed this outrage. Observers said he was cursing, and they also observed that Miller calmly reached into his vest and pulled out a business card that identified him as an attorney at law from Eugene, Oregon. He placed this business card in Busby's hand, turned on his heel, and left. In fact, that very same day, he left Skagway to visit his mining claims in the Porcupine District. So he left Skagway to go to Haines and then up the Chilkat River to the Klahini. The only thing that Miller said before he left town was this: "I cut down the British flag on my own authority by virtue of rights resting in every American citizen." And within a week, this incident hit the newspapers. And of course, the details were a bit garbled. A lot of people thought that it was the British flag or the Union Jack that had been cut down. And some local people in Skagway, when they realized it was really a customs flag, they kind of backed away from their association with Miller. But either way, this news went all across Canada and the United States. Newspapers picked up the story and framed it as an international incident. And of course, people took sides. A California paper quoted someone as saying, "The people of Skagway have shown that they will never allow Canada to steal another inch of Uncle Sam's domain." And in Eugene, Oregon, not surprisingly, they said, "Hurrah for George Miller. He's a true blue American. Why not cut down this flag?" But in the Canadian papers, they called George Miller a cowardly vandal. And they said this was not an act of patriotism, but an example of, quote, "bluff, braggadocio, and anarchy," end quote. So Busby complained to the U.S. Army commander in Skagway, and men were sent to the Porcupine mines to arrest Miller. And he was brought back on a charge of malicious destruction of private property. He was supposed to go to trial in Skagway 2 weeks later, but by that time, the Canadian government, not wanting to make any more of a stir than was necessary, they didn't think it was to their advantage, and they asked that the charges be dropped. Very soon, Miller was back out on the street. But by that time, he had already emerged as an American hero for some, for the folks who believed in manifest destiny, who thought perhaps that the United States should annex all of Canada, those that looked favorably on the idea of the United States being imperialist in its policies. And just a few months later, George Miller wrote a booklet, and this is from the cover. He was suggesting how to settle the whole matter without friction. This was written in Skagway, and I think there are only 2 copies in existence, both in California archives. And his big idea, and he was saying this to anybody who would listen, he was a big talker, was that the United States should simply purchase the Klondike. That would settle the matter. So he suggested, as you see in this map, that the present boundary at the 141st meridian should just be moved over to the 130th meridian. He didn't name a price, but he suggested that Great Britain was occupied in South Africa with the Second Boer War, and that they would be preoccupied with recovering the diamonds and gold in South Africa, so they wouldn't care so much. And he said Canada clearly had too much territory, more than it could control or exploit, and so they would also be open to such a transaction. He also pointed out that the wiggly boundary that was supposed to go around the Alexander Archipelago could be done away with, and this was a much neater solution to the problem, a much straighter boundary. So even though Miller believed that maybe we could get out of this situation without friction, there was friction, and Miller was not alone in stirring the pot. This was the 1901, the first year of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency after President McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt's aggressive foreign policy was in the news quite a bit, and his personal credo, of speaking softly and carrying a big stick. So there was a lot of talk about, not just talk, about relations between Alaskans or Americans and Canadians. And this is just a short summary of the things that were going on in 1901, in addition to the flag pulling incident. There were Americans calling themselves the Order of the Midnight Sun, who conspired to stockpile guns and ammunition and launch a surprise attack on the Northwest Mounted Police. Their plan, allegedly, was to create a republic out of the Klondike. This was mostly rumor, but it alarmed the Canadian government enough that they sent police officers and detectives to try to figure out if it was real. And George Miller's friend, Joseph Ivey, was Alaska's chief customs officer, and he forced Busby's customs office to be closed in Skagway, and Busby was relocated to Whitehorse. And again, as I pointed out, this did not help business to be conducted in Alaska or out of Skagway, but it did help Ivey's vision for pushing the Canadians back. So Ivey also used his authority as the collector of customs to bar Canadian ships that were hunting for fur seals in the Bering Sea, barred them from using Unalaska to resupply. And this caused a genuine international incident. It was much a bigger deal than the flag pulling exercise. And many people were questioning whether Ivey's career was over and whether he was insane. One newspaper said that Ivey has declared war on the British Empire. So this was the atmosphere I'm describing. The final incident, both George Miller and Joseph Ivey promoted a false notion that the Russians had erected stone boundary markers 75 years earlier, but that Canadian officials, after they found out about them, ordered that the the monuments be destroyed. And this led the U.S. government, Congress, to appoint some investigators who went hunting for rock piles in the border region, caused all sorts of confusion, and all of this brouhaha lasted into 1903, when the Boundary Tribunal finally came to a decision. Here's my last slide, suggesting that the United States annex all of Canada. And you see down the lower left, Canadian boundary issue is the one they're referring to, and Canada is distraught. So this the Boundary Tribunal that decided on the border that we know today heavily favored the United States. And this happened because the tribunal was made up of 3 American jurists, 2 Canadians, and 1 British representative. And the British representative sided with the United States on this issue, and undoubtedly to maintain good relations between the 2 countries. And Canada felt betrayed. Many people have suggested that this was a big part of Canada forming its own independent identity apart from the mother country. All right. Well, I'm still pondering what the meaning might be of George Miller's arrogant, impetuous, melodramatic act on that day in 1901. And I'm not quite sure if it's a small local Skagway story really about mining interests and customs offices and taxes, or if it's a larger question of Alaska identity, because a lot of the people who were condemning the Canadians for territorial aggression were also asking the U.S. Congress for more support, wanting to develop Alaska and have representation in Congress, complaining of federal neglect, and an Alaska identity was forming among white settlers in Alaska who had all probably only been in the area for 3-4 years or less. And then finally, I thought that this story might be more of a national and international story about patriotism, about jingoistic nationalism and imperialism, which was really on the minds of many people, given the Spanish-American War and the Panama Canal struggle that I wasn't able to cover today. But those are my thoughts. It's very much a work in progress. And if you're curious about George Miller, you might consider a trip to Florence, Oregon, where he is celebrated as the town's founding father, and where they had this wood panel carved in his honor. I found him a curious subject and very intriguing, and I look forward to writing about him more and to this whole boundary dispute era in Alaska in the future. I'd like to thank Carl Gerke and the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park for helping me with illustrations here, and also the Huntington Library in California, because they hold the booklet that I mentioned that George Miller wrote, suggesting that we buy the Klondike. And thank you very much.
Chris, fascinating tale. Some of it doesn't seem all that different from current day politics, where a certain American president wanted to buy a foreign country recently.
Yes, that's true.
So please load up the chat with your questions, and the tradition is that we take those at the end. So we'll now turn to our next speaker, who is
David, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. We do have one person who has their hand raised, Greg Harbor, and I don't know if that is a question you want to ask for Chris, or if there's some other issue. So can you maybe answer in the chat, or if you do have a question you want to ask, that we can do it at the end. I'm not getting a response. So go ahead, David. We'll
Okay.
just continue on.
Okay. So next, our next speaker is Melissa Chapin, who Mimi to her comrades. She was one of the first Alaskans who went to the former Soviet Union in the early 1990s and helped establish the relationship between Fairbanks and Russia's Saha Republic. Today, that relationship is the most active of the dozen sister city connections that were established between Alaska and Russian communities. And I'm hoping that Mimi also will touch on the qualities of fermented mare's milk, a Yakut specialty, which I am happy to have sampled. Mimi, take it away.
Thank you so much, David. That was a great introduction, and I'll try to get to the mare's milk in the end. Let me start sharing my screen. The title of my talk is Forging an International Community, A Path to Friendship Across the Taiga. This is the story of the path to friendship that was forged between the citizens of the Fairbanks North Star Borough and the Yakutsk City Administration. Yakutsk is an administrative center of vast interior region in Russia, situated like Fairbanks in the Taiga. And here you see Fairbanks citizens marching along that path. This map shows how far we as Fairbanksans had to reach across the Bering Strait to our sister, just to get you oriented. Our choice of Yakutsk as a sister city was a huge risk. The very few people in 1988 who knew anything about Yakutsk when we formed this relationship were not likely to remember it or maybe only vaguely as a region on the board game Risk. And here you see that region. In 2009, in a presentation to this society, I talked about the sometimes hilarious events that occurred as we tried to learn more about them, contact them, and our courtship process. Eventually, we did make connections, and Fairbanks North Star Borough Mayor Juanita Helms, who had been dubious about the whole venture from the start, traveled to Yakutsk with me in 1989. We were accompanied by State Representative Mike Davis. There in Yakutsk, Juanita met the charismatic mayor of Yakutsk, Pavel Borodin. You can imagine the first meetings were stiff and formal, but the true friendships began with this shish kebab duel at an outdoor picnic. It's one of my fondest memories and best pictures. The next year, the citizens of the two countries met each other in a huge exchange visit. Juanita Helms also met Governor of the Republic, Mikhail Nikolaev, right here, you can see him, when he came to Fairbanks with their delegation. This would be important later on in their relationship. Now, after my previous presentation on our relationship to the Historical Society, people asked me, what happened next? I really wasn't sure what to say. There had been a huge number of people that had traveled back and forth between Yakutsk and Fairbanks with a great range of interests. One thing I'd like to point out is how generally united the Fairbanks community was at that time in seeking to befriend the neighbors to the west. There were spinoffs to many, many other groups. But by 2008, the relationship was foundering. There were definitely bumps along this path towards friendship. As David Ramsar put it in his fantastic book on Alaska-Russian relations, Melting the Ice Curtain, there was a definite feeling that the thrill is gone. Fairbanks had what seemed to be a particular problem in that it was so much smaller in population than its sister city Yakutsk that it really couldn't accommodate all the expectations of Yakutsk. There simply were not enough people and enough organizations that wished to continue entertaining Russian visitors. And then tensions between Moscow and Washington also had an influence on government support for programs that had funded our exchanges. And then over the years, local leaders in both Yakutsk and Fairbanks were uneven in their support of the international community, and we really needed just their rubber stamp on our exchanges. There were stories that circulated around Alaska about harassment of people that went to Russia, and that didn't help either. By 2008, Yakutsk had become even more remote since Alaska Airlines had ceased its regular flights to the Russian Far East. And then there was an issue that Fairbanks has no large industries. At first, it seemed like this was a problem. The fact that there were no major businesses in Fairbanks that Yakutians found interesting had at first seemed like a real disadvantage. Fairbanks businesses were for the most part controlled in the lower 48, as many Yakutsk businesses were controlled in Moscow. In retrospect, I feel this may have been an advantage because there were no business relations established between Fairbanks and Yakutsk. There could be no sour disillusionments, no feelings of sour grapes because a business venture failed. Fairbanks and Yakutsk remained, however, connected by a number of similarities because of their geographical location in the remote taiga areas of the country. Lifestyles exemplified here. Economic activity, indigenous populations united them. And then bonds had been formed during the World War II years of the Lend-Lease program, when planes and various kinds of material were brought to Fairbanks to be loaded onto Russian planes flown by Russian pilots across the Bering Strait to Yakutsk. This was called the Lend-Lease Al-Sib route, Alaska-Siberia route. Then the presence of a university in Yakutsk had been one of the key factors in our choice of Yakutsk as a sister city, and this proved to be very important for the ongoing relationship. And what I now consider to be the second part of the story, at a meeting of the University of the Arctic held at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Governor Nikolaev came to Fairbanks and requested a meeting with Juanita Helms. A group of sister city members, people that had been on those early exchanges, came together and pledged to look for ways to continue the relationship. And here you see Juanita Helms toasting Governor Nikolaev. Over the next few years, the movement was greatly aided by Fairbanks Mayor Luke Hopkins and Anastasia Bozhdonova of the Northern Forum, who, while living in Anchorage, became an enthusiastic supporter of the Fairbanks sister city relationship. She worked, as I said, before the Northern Forum. So what's happened since 2008? There's been a lot less money going into our exchanges, but I feel that they have profited because they have been forced to have more focus. The official exchanges that we have had have been to some extent through video conferences, but we've also been fortunate to receive some small delegations from the Yakutsk City Administration, and citizens from Fairbanks have gone over to Yakutsk and always paid a visit to their mayor. We've had cultural exchanges for musicians and ice sculptors from Yakutsk have come to Fairbanks many, many times. There have been school and university video conferences. We haven't had as many students exchanging, but we've had a few exchange students at the University of Alaska. The Lend-Lease Monument, built in 2006, has been a real focus for people coming from Yakutsk as they wish to lay wreaths to honor the pilots and radio operators who helped make the Al-C boat so vital for the World War II. We've had many commemorations at the Lend-Lease Monument. The Rotary Club has maintained its ties, but mostly I think it's been personal friendships that have kept things going. And also a new focus of addressing joint challenges that both of our cities face as Arctic cities. We have the attitude that we can solve problems together. There was a wonderful exchange organized by John Eichelberger at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, Yakutia, peer-to-peer dialogue on flood management, where people from Alaska learned a lot about how Russians manage floods and predict them. And likewise, there's been a great exchange from the Alaska Center for Energy and Power with Gwen Holdman going to Sakhalin Republic and helping them learn about wind energy generation. I think this is the way for the future for our collaborations, and I'm really excited about this. In 2018, my husband Terry and I visited Yakutsk. It just happened that we were able to be there on City Day, which is the day that they celebrate the establishment of their city. And we visited a photo exhibition, which showed pictures of Yakutsk then and Yakutsk now. And I found this picture of a girl looking across the river at two different points in time to be especially evocative. I think it says it all about how the city has changed. The picture was taken intentionally at exactly the same spot. We got together with Anastasia Bozhdanova and the mayor of Yakutsk. He was the acting mayor at the time, but you will all be glad to know that he was a historian, not a politician. And he enthusiastically approved the idea of providing some sort of a written document about this relationship. I had been wanting to do this for a long time and stuck on several issues. I've been collecting pictures and interviews. We decided together that the best thing to do, just to celebrate the fact that we've done this 30 years almost, it was at that time, that we would prepare a photograph album. This would avoid a lot of negative issues, focus on things that did happen, not on things that didn't happen. My tasks as a Fairbanksan were to collect the pictures and provide them to Yakutsk by email. And I would also produce an outline and write some introductions to sections, while they on their hand would also look for pictures and do some writing about the volume. But the main task of Yakutsk was to select from the more than 1,000 pictures that I provided to them, which ones they wanted to put into the volume, and they would translate all my writings and all the captions to the pictures into Russian. And on top of everything else, they would pay for the design and the printing, which they did in Moscow, or they paid to Moscow to do it. The result was, I think, that the Yakutsk administration did a superb job of preparing the book. And my text, I felt, was well preserved and well translated. They didn't make any changes in what I said. And the selection of the photos preserved my original intention to showcase the individual people-to-people friendships formed, the commonalities between our cities, and to show people doing things, not just the collection of ceremonial toasts. And I can show you a copy of the book, but I thought I would show you just as a sample some of the pages that they did and how they set it up with the parallel texts, with the captions in Russian and English. They always put the dates of the photograph and show the historic progression of time from 1994 to 2012, for example, here. They did a really spectacular job, and I really like the whole formatting of the book. Now, as some of you know, the Russian volume has been printed. They printed 50 for each city, so 100 in all, but all 100 are still in Yakutsk because of problems of transportation and the fact that I haven't been back to Yakutsk to get them or found anyone to get them for me. In the meantime, I've prepared a Fairbanks variant, which is will be available, and it's fairly cheap. Probably I will give a lot of copies away to people, but that is a project that I feel very happy to have done, and I'm very excited about having done it with such great collaboration from Yakutsk. So the question is, where does the path lead from here? As I felt in 2009 when I spoke to the Alaska Historical Society, I'm not sure. Where does the path lead from here? But I'm really happy to say that we've had 30 years of a productive relationship. Thanks to the Historical Society and everybody else.
Okay, thank you so much, Mimi. Congratulations on both publications. I look forward to seeing them. And maybe we can talk at some point about how to get those Russian books over here. I'm kind of in the same boat that you are.
David, I'm going to jump in here a second on some housekeeping things that people have been writing questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and we're trying to keep it all in the chat because that's what shows up and gets saved more directly. And also, Chris, you were writing back to individual people and people were sending questions to the hosts. And so not everybody in the group gets to see all that. And so we're really trying to keep it that at the end and people write their questions to everybody, not just to the host and panelists, and to try not to do it all right in the middle of somebody else's presentation because people get distracted. So David, I don't know, you want to read all the questions and answers, or
Sure.
you want me to do that?
No, I can take that. Why don't we take several questions to Chris, and then we'll give people time to compose their questions to Mimi. So the first one I see is, what was George Miller's role in the porcupine mining dust? Maybe you'll have to explain that a little bit. And you're on mute, Chris.
His role, as all that I know, is that newspapers described him as a half owner of owning half interest in the porcupine mine, to whatever extent it was developed at the time, and also having owning 100 mining claims in the same area. So he was invested, perhaps heavily invested, in the porcupine.
And there were a couple of questions about his limited edition book. What's the story on that? Is it digitized?
Well, I have a digital copy that was sent to me by the Huntington Library, but otherwise, no, not digitized or online. I ordered it from them sight unseen because it sounded great in the catalog description. So if you'd like to see it, please contact me.
Is it mostly like a pamphlet?
Yeah, it has that map and cover leaves, and it's probably only 6 pages long.
Okay. And tell us a little bit more about Miller's life after he went back south.
He moved back to Oregon and didn't spend all that many years in Alaska. I think probably by 1903 he was gone. He did go back to Eugene and Florence. He heavily promoted the idea of a cross-continental highway. Of course, he wanted the highway to come to Florence there on the coast, sort of a coast-to-coast highway in the United States was his big dream. And I can't remember when that dream became a reality, but it was after his death. He died, ironically enough, when he was hit by a car in 1933.
And I also wondered, what was the Canadian reaction to the proposal to buy the Klondike? I assume that didn't go over all that well in Canada.
Well, one imagines not, but I wish I had some responses to his pamphlet, to his concept, but I don't have any. Certainly, by 1903, everyone was sick of this Alaska boundary question, and they were happy that it was finally resolved. I mean, the Americans were happy. The Canadians were very disappointed, as I said earlier. But that finally the tribunal could adjourn and put this all behind us. I have another illustration that I didn't use of Teddy Roosevelt standing astride North America and all the way from the Panama Canal to Alaska, and he has a foot on each, and a big stick in his hand. So it's obviously this was part of the whole struggle for dominance in the hemisphere, and Alaska played at least a small role in that.
And then there's a question about the 130th meridian proposal. Could you talk a bit more about that and provide any resources to people who are interested in getting more information?
Well, I'm in the middle of writing an article about Joseph Ivey, who was the collector of customs, a friend of Miller's. And it's a two-part article, and I'm on the second part. So all of the references, all the citations will be in that article when it's published, I hope, in the AHS journal eventually. But that may not happen for a good while. And I don't have much information specific to George Miller. I picked him as a subject for this conference presentation because it was a kind of micro history, a kind of one man on one day, one international incident, and I have more research to do.
Have you ever sort of wondered what would have happened if the original proposal to move the border closer to Tidewater had come about? Skagway would have been a Canadian town. How else would that have affected Southeast?
Right. Well, the other end of the border issue was at Portland Canal, so it almost certainly would have changed if the Canadians had their way. The configuration of Hyder and Stewart there. So Hyder, the Alaska town at the end of the Portland Canal, and Stewart, the Canadian community just across the line. It would have also influenced the Porcupine mining district there on the Klahini, on a tributary of the Klahini River. It would have changed Alaska history profoundly, I think.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, well, if you have additional questions of Chris, please chime in, and we'll turn to Mimi now for a few questions. Mimi, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about how you guys in Fairbanks selected Yakutsk. I know you were considering places that were similar to Fairbanks, that had similar economic foundations. From my time in Yakutsk, I mean, the two places look pretty similar. Flat, cold, people sort of feel like they're with their neighbors against the environment up there. Can you just talk about the process? Because I think you guys were just sort of throwing darts at dartboards trying to figure out where you would be a sister city with.
Absolutely, David. It was really a crazy time because it seemed like everybody was talking about having a sister city or making ties across the Bering Straits, but all the other communities in Alaska were on the ocean. And we knew that Fairbanks would have nothing in common with a city in Russia that was on the ocean. So we knew we had to look at interior cities. That was a given. whereas, other places were maritime. So then we looked interior and we couldn't find out very much about any of the cities there. And finally, I went to the university library and I found a CIA handbook on Russia, on Siberia. Well, and it had a little paragraph about this big about Yakutsk. And you remember in those days, we couldn't, just sit down and like I do every day now, look at the news in Yakutsk and find out how the forest fires are going. We had to figure out how to contact them and what they even look like. A few people had been to Yakutsk, but they had very old pictures of it. Anyway, from the CIA handbook, we found out that it was had many similarities in terms of its economy, its population, and it had a university. And we felt that we had to have a city that had a university. None of the other cities in the Russian Far East or Far North had universities. They had pedagogical institutes, but not universities. And so eventually it came down to Yakutsk looked good and it had a university. And that was why we chose it.
And can you talk a bit about the difference in how the cities supported their sister city activity? I know on the Russian side, frequently they would have government-owned hotels that they could house people in. And on the Alaska side, frequently we would do homestays. There seemed to be Russian government money available to support these activities. But on the Alaska side, it was largely sponsored by citizens. Can you talk about how that worked?
Yes, of course. That was exactly the truth, that we would not have had such a great sister city program in those early days if Pavel Borodin had not supported it by, in the first year, chartering a Russian plane and bringing over a load of 40 Russians to Fairbanks and taking 40 people from Fairbanks back to Russia. And then at the end of 10 days or 2 weeks, I can't remember exactly what it was, he made the return trip, taking the Fairbanksians back to Fairbanks and the Russians, the Yakutians back to Yakutsk. That set us up. And we from there on, we did homestays. We didn't have hotels. I do believe I think some chits were called in to get free rooms in hotels from time to time. But on the other hand, the people that we were working with in Yakutsk understood that what we wanted was a people-to-people kind of exchange. And so after the first exchange, we stayed in homes in Yakutsk. I think that they probably gave some money to the people that hosted, but it was money that was used to buy food to feed their guests. So I think it was I think it benefited from the fact that the Yakutians understood the fact that we wanted a people-to-people exchange, not an official kind of exchange.
And there's a question about after Alaska Airlines stopped flying to the Russian Far East, how does one get to Yakutsk?
Oh, that's a long story. There have been Yakutia Airlines has flown some flights in the summertime at very inconvenient times so that people have made the connection that way. When I go to Yakutsk, I go through Moscow because I have a number of friends in Moscow and I love going to Moscow and St. Petersburg. So you either go all the way around or you find some way to get there. There's also the possibility of going to China and then to Vladivostok and flying to Yakutsk or going to Beijing. There's different ways you can do it. They're not convenient and they're expensive, but there are ways to do it. And Yakutia Airlines has decided that they will have flights again this summer. They suspended them last summer. So there's another possibility.
So that's great. So there are a couple questions about current exchanges. Maybe you could talk about what you guys are up to these days. Are you aware of any future activities planned between your sister city and then others that Alaska cities have. I could talk a bit about that.
I don't know too much about what's going on in other cities, so I'd be glad if you talk about that. We have been wanting to have some sort of a virtual conference on our exchange, and I would basically talk about this book and talk about the fact that it exists, and we would get other people to talk about what they remember of the exchange and maybe show a few clips of some of the fantastic movies that are coming out of Yakutsk these days. We've had some great ideas like that, but they haven't really come to a point at which I can announce it right at this minute. I hoped I would be able to, but I'm not. So I'm not going to talk about something that I don't know when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen. But just recently, one of the members of our group is very interested in the issues of permafrost and indigenous peoples in Yakutsk. And both he and my husband, Terry, have been participating in a Northern Forum sponsored event on sustainable futures in the Arctic regions. And so the interchange is ongoing between Yakutsk and Fairbanks.
And are you aware of any Yakutsk students going to school at UAF?
Not this year. There was a student just before that was here just before the pandemic, and she left. And I don't know what's going on right now.
Okay. Yeah, during this era, there were about a dozen sister cities relationships established between Alaska and Russia. You guys continue to be the most active. Anchorage and Magadan, Nome and Providencia, Juneau, and a portion of district in Vladivostok. And I was interested in your mention about how ties between Fairbanks and Yakutsk sort of picked up when a new borough mayor came to town. I think that's the case in Anchorage as well. Some mayors have been very active in this area, a lot less so. And it seems like when they want to participate, then the relationship gets going again. So how are things now? Do you have support from your local leaders up there?
We do. We had a really exciting exchange in 2019, just before the pandemic came and hit us all. We had some people come, 3 people come from Yakutsk, and for the AFN conference here that was held that year in Fairbanks. Mm-hmm. It was a really exciting time, and we got lots of support. I mean, not money, but moral support, I should say, and help from the mayor's office, Fairbanks North Star Borough's mayor's office. And I do think that it does depend a lot upon the support and interest of the local leader. And I thought of thinking about that picture of the duel on the banks of the Lena River in Yakutsk. It's sort of like one side is reaching out and the other side is drawing back, and then it switches over and the other side reaches out and the other side draws back. It's just that's the way. Those are the bumps in the road. That's what happens.
There's another question. In exchanges with Russians visiting Fairbanks, was there ever any concern expressed or acted on about Russians spying on the local military bases in the Fairbanks area?
Of course, that issue was discussed a lot. And at that time, the Russians, when were able to visit the bases here, there was so much gossip there's going on. I really don't know what to say. I'm sure there were some people from Russia that came over here that were interested to find things out, but I don't think that they found out very much. And it was, as I say, it was mostly at the level of, oh, this is a funny story. Just think he was taking all those pictures of the planes or something like that. And nobody seemed to be too concerned about it.
Well, I remember in the early days of flying to the Russian side, particularly Anadyr, which is a little town south of Providenia, which is a military base. You were not allowed to take pictures of all the MiG fighters that were lined up on the airstrip there because they were intercepting American aircraft like we intercept Russian aircraft from Elmendorf and Eielson. So, but I think that that's been relaxed quite a bit. And I think in the early days, my sense is that all the Russian delegations sent sort of KGB minders over just to kind of keep track of these exchanges. Did you have any of those interactions?
I'm sure that they did. They were. I mean, there were people that we were quite sure were KGB minders, and there was one person that talked about defecting, and she suddenly got a lot of calls from somebody else that was staying at somebody else's home and that sort of thing. We were aware of that going on. Nobody did. I don't believe that anybody defected actually here in Fairbanks. I could be wrong about that. And I'm sure that America sent some people over to Russia with our exchanges, that we would have suddenly somebody appear in our exchange group of 40 people, somebody I'd never heard of that didn't seem to know Fairbanks and seemed to have some vague memories of being in Vietnam. And, you know, you just sort of go, okay, whatever.
Another question, do you know if the Northern Forum is active in Alaska these days?
Well, they were active to the extent that they did organize this conference and invited some Alaskans to participate in the conference that we just had 27th to 30th of September. I know there was talk of having a grand celebration of the 30 years of the Northern Forum's existence this fall, but I haven't heard anything more about that.
But I think the forum has moved its headquarters from Anchorage to Yakutsk, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So
No,
yeah.
it's not active. It does not have a center in Alaska anymore.
Right.
But Alaska is a member of the Northern Forum's list of member states.
Okay. And one thing I would like to ask about is in the process of the book publication, when you were dealing with Yakutsk, was there ever any objection to any of your references? And the reason I ask is because when I had my own book translated in Vladivostok, there was pretty strong pushback on a couple of issues that were not particularly favorable to the Russian side. And they almost flat out refused to include those sections in the book. And I wondered if you encountered any of that.
That's a really interesting question, David. And in my talk, I said that we were trying to talk about the things that we did accomplish, not the things that we didn't accomplish. And part of the reason for doing that, I think, was because I didn't want to get into any areas that would be sensitive. I wanted the book to be published. And I realized that I don't regard the book as a historical document. I look at it as a celebration of 30 years of our friendship. So I had no pushback from them on anything. They did select pictures, but I thought it was interesting that I loved the fact that they included a picture of Soviet soldiers here in Fairbanks walking up and down the streets during World War II. And, you know, some of the pictures that I just thought were just wonderful, like that, or the students at the university learning to play Monopoly as a way of learning English. You know, they put in things like that I thought were just so nice, such a nice personal touch.
And so you're still trying to get some copies of the Russian book to Alaska?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, it looks like we've gotten through all the questions. I don't know if anybody has any others. I haven't looked in the Q&A. Is there anything
Yeah,
else?
there's one in the Q&A to Chris on who was the British member of the Boundary Commission that made a deal with Teddy Roosevelt, and what was the deal? And then Mimi, there's a long Mimi, there's a long message to you in the chat from Rachel Myron, so you might want to read that.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay.
I believe that the British member of the tribunal was Lord Alverstone, and I don't know what detail, what deal was cut. I don't know, but that's I think well documented in numerous books about the boundary settlement and the boundary dispute. It's just something I would have to look up, but and I was trying to deal with the grassroots or on the ground activity during this period rather than the well documented tribunal goings on. But it's a good question. Lord Alverstone, I believe, is the answer to that.
Victoria Chilcoot raises an interesting question. Another interesting history worth investigating from the historical perspective is the maritime border established between the Soviet Union and the US and the current attitude to that borderline. I assume you're not an expert in that area, Chris?
No. No.
Okay. We'll have another presenter take up that issue. I don't know that much about it. Okay, any other questions from anybody? We're a little bit early, but I think we did pretty well with two excellent speakers. Lots of new information to everybody. Thanks to you both for your excellent presentations and to everybody paying attention. And I'll hand it back to Karen, I guess.
To me.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And so, yeah, we'll have a little bit of a longer break. So at 3:30 will be the panel discussion on teaching American history. So we hope to see everybody back then.